The Defense Department and its contractors have more time to search systems to remove components Chinese companies made. The deadline that was supposed to come last Thursday is now September 30th. Gordon Bitko, Senior Vice President of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council. He's former Chief Information Officer at the FBI. Gordon, welcome back. It's good to have you back. What is going on here with this deadline slide? What exactly do companies have to do?
Francis, thank you for having me back. I'm sorry that it's a virtual presence, not in person. I look forward to being back in the studio one of these days. But let me give a quick overview of 889 for those of you who don't know. 889 is the second part of a section from the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Act from 2019. Part A went into effect last year and it banned the government from directly procuring from those covered entities. So they're not allowed to procure products from Huawei, ZTE, and a number of named providers of video surveillance equipment as well. Part B, which is going into effect now, and although DoD has gotten a waiver for a few weeks, for the rest of government, it's still in effect. Part B requires those contractors who are doing business with government to also make representations that they are not using products from those covered entities. And that's really incredibly broad, Francis, right? It doesn't cover just large defense procurements. It covers everything from those all the way down to the smallest commercial products being acquired as micro purchases with a government credit card. Those are covered as well. And so everybody doing business with the government is going to have to make representations that they don't have these products in their supply chain, or to request a waiver. And the waiver process in itself is somewhat complex and frankly likely to discourage many people from requesting a waiver because of the amount of work that they'll have to put into processing that.
This goes really far down into the industrial base of both the Defense Department and the civilian agencies too, doesn't it, Gordon?
That's correct, Francis. It really touches on everything. I mean, this literally is affecting all government procurements, and there are a number of issues here that still need to be resolved that, if they aren't, have the potential to really call contracting and procurements into question. I think it's a good thing that the Department of Defense got this waiver until the end of the fiscal year, because as we all know, the end of the fiscal year is when a lot of contract activities occur. And this will enable them to process those between now and the end of the fiscal year. But for other agencies and for even the department come October 1, there are some real challenges still to being able to effectively do procurements. The rule that came out doesn't really provide a lot of the specificity that is needed.
I want to talk about some of those challenges if we have time, Gordon, but it strikes me as interesting that the Defense Department got a waiver, the civilian agencies don't. And I wonder if you see a disparity there, or maybe some possibility of a reason behind the disparity.
I think that the department has been actively engaged with their supplier base, with industry, and understands the risks and the consequences, and has been proactive in talking about some of the challenges with implementing this rule. Undersecretary Lord testified a month or two ago, and she actually recommended to Congress a year-long delay so that they could work out some of these issues. So I think that highlights that the Department of Defense has been proactively trying to address these challenges. And some of the other agencies, I think, maybe have not been as forward-leaning, so they haven't been out there requesting that waiver.
So I want to ask you about those challenges you alluded to a few moments ago, Gordon. It strikes me that in some cases it's pretty simple. A company looks at the products that it's offering and says, we can sell this one still, we can't sell this one anymore. That's pretty straightforward. In other cases, it's much more complicated. How should organizations be going through their infrastructures, their product offerings, their service deliveries, and deciding what they can keep and what they can't keep?
Yeah, I think that really cuts to the heart of the matter, Francis. You're right. In some cases, it's going to be very straightforward. It's a product that is directly using one of these covered equipment from one of these covered entities, and that's out. There are going to be other cases where that's a lot harder to figure out. And part of that is because the rule, which just came out last month, doesn't really specify what a reasonable inquiry is. So it's leaving it up to companies to figure that out for themselves. In other words, it does say you don't need to do a full audit, but it doesn't say, for example, in the current climate, many employees are working remotely from home. They might be using network service providers who are using covered equipment. Is that covered under this rule or not? Those things are not clear, and so I think that there's need for more guidance to still come out to address this. Otherwise, the risk is that different contracting officers and different agencies will interpret that differently, and that's going to cause a lot of confusion. You might be allowed to make a representation in one contract in one way, and in a different one, you won't be able to make that representation. And I think another really important point about all this, just to note very quickly, Francis, is that the scope is beyond just if an entity has a subsidiary that does business directly with the government. It covers their business that they're doing commercially as well. So if a company is doing business with the government and doesn't use covered equipment there, but does in other business lines of theirs, that's also required to be disclosed in this rule. So that's again a very significant and broad interpretation of the requirements.
Less than a minute left, Gordon. Where should that guidance come from, and what would make it clear enough in your view that companies would get it, but it would also reach the intended goal of securing this equipment and eliminating the equipment that the government thinks is a risk?
Yeah, there's no doubt that there's a real risk there, Francis. I think one of the things that we would really like to see is the Secure Technology Act identified the need for a risk-based process and for the Federal Acquisition Supply Council to really take the lead on this. And what I would really like to see, what industry would really like to see, is a true risk-based approach with consistent guidance, not continuous different statutes and executive orders and requirements coming out about supply chain issues, but one consistent set of guidance that's risk-based and that's done in conjunction with industry, who's able to provide real input on what the risks are and what things can be done to mitigate those risks outright, and what things can be done short of ripping equipment out when that's not necessary. And unfortunately, that's still a long ways to go.
Gordon Bitko, thanks very much as always. Great to see you.
Francis, thank you again for having me.